focus a lot on the president Andrew Jackson, because he's really kind of an important figure. He represents in American history an important shift to a more popularly elected president. Um, and so this is going to be broken up into two lectures. The first one kind of giving some basic information about how he came to power, and his dealings with Native Americans. And the next lecture is going to talk about more broadly states' rights and that sectional issue again, and the role Jackson sort of plays in that. So in this first lecture, we're going to talk about how Andrew Jackson, comes to become president. So he was actually a son of Irish immigrants. So he's a first generation American. He does he makes a lot of money throughout his life. He becomes a wealthy plantation owner. He does own slaves, and he kind of is the typical American success story, right? He starts out relatively poor and becomes pretty wealthy. He's also a very important military general, a military leader, and he is the man. Andrew Jackson is the general who leads the Americans to victory in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And so he's sort of a national hero. He's well liked by the ordinary person, the common person, and that's going to bode well for him eventually. So the first time he runs for president is actually in the year 1824, but he loses to John Quincy Adams. And this is one of the first examples. I'm not sure if it's the first. I would have to double check that, but one of the first examples of when someone who wins the popular vote does not win the electoral vote, right? And this is something that is very present and common in our own news cycle today, right? President-elect Biden did happen to win both, but there was a little bit of time there where people weren't sure if he was going to win the electoral college. And so this issue of popular vote versus electoral college comes up constantly, regularly, I should say, throughout American history. So he does actually not win that election. John Quincy Adams becomes president, but he only serves for one term. And beginning before the election of 1824, but then continuing after it, many states in the Union begin giving up their property requirement for voting. And so historically, right, when the Constitution was first formed and the states were first formed, voting was kind of reserved for those white men who owned property. That was kind of who was allowed to vote. By the time Jackson becomes president, many of those states do away with the property requirement, and it's just white men of a certain age. I think it was 21 at the time can vote. And so that increases the population of eligible voters because many people who don't own property now can vote. And so the next election cycle in 1828, Andrew Jackson is elected president by appealing to that common person, right? This becomes more important as non-property owners could now vote. It's more important to appeal to those who are, the common folks, so to speak, people who maybe aren't as well educated, who definitely aren't as wealthy, but who can now have some sort of power, some sort of influence in the government. And so that's how he wins his election. And when he's put into power, when he gets into power, he kind of promotes the idea of a spoil system. Another word for this might be nepotism. And essentially, it's giving people who you like and people who supported you in the lead up to the election important government positions. So it's not really based on merit necessarily, but it's based on connections and giving positions to people who helped you. Which, kind of in hindsight, that's maybe not the best way of doing it, but then again, it's still kind of the way things are done in a way today. Although this, people might say there's more kind of qualification criteria needed today, but it's still ultimately people who supported you who are going to be kind of first in line for these important positions. Right, and one more point about this, and you'll notice this as President-elect Biden begins thinking about who he wants to be in these important positions in the government. He's going to look to the people in his campaign, the people who helped him get where he is, right? And so this spoil system is not really gone today. It still kind of exists in some form today. Right, kind of one of the most controversial aspects of Andrew Jackson's presidency is the treatment of Native Americans. Definitely up for controversy, up for debate about, should we kind of praise Jackson or should we shun him because of how he treated this group of people? And particularly in the southern states at this time, there's growing white population, and this is causing even more tension still with Native American groups that live in these regions. These Native American groups still have substantial land holdings, but they're much weakened than they were when these white Americans first arrived. And the white settlers coveted or really desired these Native American lands. And so President Jackson signs into law, right? A law passed by Congress first, right? Because presidents don't make up laws; they have to sign them based on what Congress gives them. But the Indian Removal Act of 1830, And this law relocated Native Americans in the Southeast to lands in the Midwest, particularly to Oklahoma. Oklahoma is essentially one giant Indian reservation. And interesting enough, a recent Supreme Court case in modern day actually just kind of ruled that most of it is Indian reservation, and so that has a lot of interesting, could have a lot of interesting consequences. But anyway, so that's where most of these Native American groups go, are forced to go, is to Oklahoma. Of course, though, Native Americans resist this. They don't want to leave their ancestral lands, their traditional lands, and they resist it in a couple different ways. The Seminoles, who are predominantly in Florida, resist a little more forcefully. They refuse to give up their land. There's a little bit of fighting that goes on. And many Seminoles actually are still in Florida today, so it was somewhat successful in the fact that they were able to kind of stay where they are, based on this resistance. Other nations like the Cherokee decided to go the legal route. They tried to engage the American system to kind of protect themselves. So this Cherokee Nation, which was in Georgia, and that was the state of Georgia, sued for the right to stay on land, on the land they had. The Supreme Court, interesting enough, actually recognizes the Cherokee as a distinct political community, and actually supports them, says they cannot be forced to leave, that the state of Georgia cannot force them to leave. Right? The only thing that could happen is if the Cherokee signed a treaty with the federal government. That's the only way this land could be given up. Otherwise, they have right to it, which is pretty interesting. Andrew Jackson did not appreciate this or like this, and he said that Marshall has kind of made the law, now let him enforce it. Right? Kind of saying that just because he says it doesn't mean it's going to happen. And so eventually they are forced to leave. But this is kind of showing a graphic here showing all these different Native American groups, predominantly from the South. We also have some up in the Midwest who were forced off their lands in the 1820s, 1830s. And they almost all go to the modern day state of Oklahoma and parts of Kansas. And the kind of infamous Trail of Tears you may have heard of before is actually not done by Andrew Jackson, but the president who succeeds him, which is President Martin Van Buren, who would be the 8th president of the United States. And they forcefully removed the last Cherokee across the Mississippi into that Oklahoma territory. And so in the fall of 1838, you have this 800-mile trip that these Native Americans make to these Indian reservations that they do predominantly by foot, right? So that's a lot of walking. Unfortunately, many die along the way, and much of their wealth and much of their belongings are either taken by criminals, out in the wilderness, or by government officials, corrupt government officials. And finally, when they do finally arrive there, the land they were given and promised was nowhere near the quality of land that they had just left or been forced to leave. And so this kind of dark moment in American history is known as the Trail of Tears, because it shows kind of really the injustices done to this group of people. And a large amount of these Native Americans actually died on the way, right, which is tragic. And so that's kind of just a quick, brief overview of President Jackson and the Native American issue. And in class, we're going to be looking at some documents about this and kind of seeing why Jackson did this. And should he be kind of completely cast aside as this horrible man, or is there some justification, no matter how flawed it might be, that this maybe was what he thought was the best thing to do?